All right, in this video, we are going to talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and we will also be including flow in this video. It's just a few slides on flow, and it's an interesting topic, so shouldn't add too much time-wise here, but let's get into it. So intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, basically this difference in motivation is distinguishing between incentives that are either inherent in the task or that are stemming from outside of the task. So those that are inherent in the task are called intrinsic. And for these, the activity is motivating in itself and it's done for enjoyment, not anything like pay or points or anything like that, just simply done because we like it, versus an extrinsically motivated activity behavior is done solely for incentives. So this is just done because you might get paid for it. Yeah, or maybe if you don't do it, you'll get punished, something like that. Interestingly, we see kind of a paradoxical undermining effect where if we already have intrinsic motivation and we try to add on extrinsic motivation to that, overall motivation and behavior will sometimes go down. And so this is an example of that. I think this is really interesting because it differs from what we previously learned, right, with operant conditioning and the law of effect, which theorized that whenever we are reinforced or rewarded for something, we should do that behavior more. And so based on that, we would expect that, well, if we have both intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, we should be doing this behavior more. But we see that that's not always the case. So this study is a good example of this undermining effects. Basically what happens in the study is preschool kids are playing with markers. They love to do that. And then in a couple of these conditions, they were rewarded with a good player award. This was just a sticker, but to preschoolers, maybe that's not just a sticker. They typically love stickers, right? But anyways, so in group one, if the preschoolers used the markers, they were told they would receive this good player award. In group two, the preschoolers were not offered a reward for marker use, but were given one after they were done. So this is that unexpected reward. Versus in group three, they were asked to draw with markers, but just no reward was given. What was measured was the percentage of a certain amount of time that was spent playing with these markers. And interestingly, the lowest amount of time is those who expected the reward or who expected that extrinsic motivation. That's even lower than those who didn't receive any reward at all. So this is a prime example of that undermining effect where theoretically what goes on here is that an extrinsic reward then decreases the original intrinsic motivation that was there. Interestingly, new research that has been done, relatively new research that's been done on this, actually some of it right here in the Motivation and Cognition Lab at the University of Wyoming. That was done, I think they finished that up the year before I got here, but anyways, that they found generally small effects with this. So they did find undermining effects, and additionally, they did this on adults, but the effects did seem to be there, but they were pretty small. So maybe a little bit less meaningful or less large than initially thought, and than what we see here in this study. Something that has come out of this general undermining idea is self-determination theory. This is a very prominent theory today in motivation, includes aspects of both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and what that might lead to. But anyways, the basic idea is that identities differ in how assimilated they are to the self. So some might seem not very assimilated and are first forced onto the self. Examples of that could be your major that you picked, which maybe if someone else told you to do this major, or a parent or something like that. Same idea with political views. This could feel forced onto the self and not very assimilated, versus we can also have identities, right, that are more assimilated and become internalized and core to our identity. And certainly, if these things are our own ideas and are don't feel forced onto ourselves, that can also be something that is internalized and becomes intrinsic. But yeah, the basic idea behind self-determination theory is what level these various identities become assimilated to ourselves. In other words, this is getting at whether motivation is autonomous, whether that's our own thing, our own intrinsic motivation, or whether it feels controlled, extrinsic motivation, whether it's feels like it's coming from these external sources. And these internal pursuits or intrinsic motivation or assimilated identities, whatever you want to call them, can fulfill some of these psychological needs that we've talked about in the past. So we've talked about competency, relatedness, and autonomy, right? An example, competence, say you really like math, you're really good at it. You don't have to try to enjoy it, you just do. This can fulfill your competency need. Additionally, a lot of times the things that we like to do, like say you play an instrument and you really like it, or a sport, this can be, or is often something that we do with other people, especially our friends. And so that can fulfill our relatedness need. Finally, again, if these identities are internalized, they are autonomous, right? They don't feel forced onto us by external sources. And so we can fulfill this autonomy need through our internal pursuits. Here is an example of the differential effects that these more assimilated or intrinsically motivated behaviors might lead to versus those extrinsically motivated behaviors. So which motive predicts regular exercise, either appearance or fitness goals, or enjoying exercise? So this can be something, maybe not always, but something that is potentially often stemming from some external source and is more of an external source of motivation, versus if you actually enjoy this exercise, that's going to be more intrinsic, right? More assimilated with the self. And so, yeah, in other words, basing this exercise based on something that feels extrinsic and that you almost feel forced to do versus something that you actually enjoy to do and is assimilated. So what we see here is that intrinsic or assimilated motivation is more predictive of the behavior. And so in this study, groups either adhered or didn't to an exercise regimen for longer than a week. And we see that for those who did, there were differences for initial enjoyment and post-workout enjoyment. So enjoyment was higher in those who were adhering to this exercise regimen for over a week, versus, sure, there are slight differences here for appearance and fitness in the way that you would expect, but these were not statistically significant differences. That's what the star means for these. So yeah, the takeaway for this is pick exercises that or sports that you enjoy. So if you enjoy lifting weights, you'll be more likely to stick to a regimen of that versus running if you hate running. And yeah, I can think of other examples for that. Kind of on a similar mindset, there's always this idea of buying happiness, right? And so this graph here shows that that doesn't really work out too great. Basically, we have the real income per capita over the course of about 30 years here, and then we also have change in happiness. We do see this general increase in wealth here in the United States over this time period, but happiness generally stays the same. So if you could buy happiness, we would expect to see a similar increase in happiness in this data here. So when comparing wealthy nations, this is typically not always with every person living in these wealthy nations for sure, but in general, it's just looking at increases in money when needs are typically already met, right? And so this, for this kind of country, the relationship is weak or non-existent between happiness and increases in money. However, there's definitely a basic needs component that comes into play. So, if you're comparing a wealthier nation to one where a lot of people are struggling just to find food and water, this you would likely find a stronger relationship here, right? Because they're not meeting those just basic biological safety needs that are needed, as we saw in that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But let's say he really wants to still buy happiness, even though it might not work out too great. There are still some strategies that might help out a little bit for that. So just some ideas here are to buy experiences as opposed to buying things, because things are usually adapted pretty fast. And what I mean by that is, say you buy a new car, this has the potential to bring quite a bit of enjoyment at the very beginning, but oftentimes what happens is we go back relatively quickly to our status quo level of happiness, and this doesn't end up buying long-term happiness. It's more of just a quick thing. So experiences, on the other hand, have slower adaptation. Helping others, this gets at social connectivity and that relatedness need. So using your money to help others, often in addition to being just a good thing to do, also makes us feel better and happier for doing that. Delaying gratification, interestingly, we typically like anticipation, and we feel rewarded by it. And also consider what other people enjoy. And we have plenty of information on this now, right? So we have ratings for pretty much every restaurant out there and things like that. Although there are certainly stipulations to this, like social media, definitely not a good place to gather information about what people enjoy, right? An example could be, say, you follow your neighbors on Instagram and they're a couple with a kid and they decided to go on vacation to Disneyland, and you see that, oh, they posted this picture, they really loved it, I should probably go to Disneyland and get that happiness too. What you might not see is that that picture could have been taken at 8 in the morning when everybody was all excited to make it to Disneyland, right? And everyone's really excited to meet Mickey Mouse and go on the rides. What isn't shown in that picture is that, at 3 p.m., the kid's crying. So little 6-year-old Johnny, or whatever the kid's name is, been walking around all day and is tired and cranky. And then the adults are getting cranky too from the kid crying and standing in line for an hour for 5-minute rides and things like that. So just an example. But anyways, additionally, beware of good deals. This obviously also has stipulations. Sometimes good deals are just good deals and they're awesome. However, sometimes good deals involve getting what you pay for. So you pay less and you get less. And we oftentimes get really excited about buying things on a good deal, but then we get really disappointed if that thing that we got on a good deal breaks 2 days later. And then we feel really badly about that. And we feel the need or really want to get another one. And then next thing you know, that good deal is ruined when you have to buy two. All right, just a few slides on flow here. This is, I think this is a really interesting idea. Basically, flow is the ideal level of intrinsic motivation. So this is going to be things that we just inherently enjoy. This is the feeling of optimal challenge. This might sound a little bit like what we've learned in the past in terms of our resources meeting the demands that are required for a task. Additionally, the demands of the activity are clear. So in other words, we know exactly what we have to do. There's no ambiguity with that. There should be a smooth pursuit of action. There is typically no need for effortful concentration. You don't have to force yourself to do it. It just happens naturally. There are also things like a sense of time changes and the merging of action and awareness. This happens because you're just so lost and so involved in this activity that you're doing and really enjoying. And these, again, are intrinsically motivated and are usually just rewarding and fun in themselves. So please watch this video. It is a little bit long, but I think it's really, really interesting. It's a TED Talk, and it gets at the characteristics of flow and when flow is likely to happen. And I mean, I typically like TED Talks in general, but I think this one is really good. So give that a watch. And overall, flow in general involves high task engagement and usually leads to optimal performance. This channel model gives a chart of a good idea of when flow happens. And so flow happens most often, and the quality of flow is best when demands are high and skill level is high. When skill level and demands don't match, we don't have flow, right? And so when our skill level is low, but the demands are high, we feel anxiety. This is pretty similar, and it's going to sound like what we talked about in that biological motivation lecture, right? In terms of the threat response that occurs. And then on the flip side of that, when we're really good at something, but it's just too easy for us, we usually get bored. And so when the demands are high, but our skills are high enough to match that, we'll have this total immersion in the task and our performance will usually be high. So final slide here, people who experience flow, oftentimes we will see, again, better performance. So an example of this is better academic achievement. So if an individual is taking classes that they really like and the classes are getting the individuals to challenge themselves, and finally, the student has the ability the skills to meet those demands, better academic achievement happens and we see flow. Additionally, there is this, we talked about in the intrinsic, extrinsic part of this lecture, the undermining effect. Those who are experiencing flow will show resistance to this undermining effect of reward or external incentives. However, there can be one negative with this, and that is increased risk-taking, which just means that if you are going for flow, right, you're going to be going for these high demands. You're going to be trying to push yourself as far as you can to see if your skills are high enough to meet these demands. And sometimes that will lead to failing. Sometimes that's not bad. Failure can be needed to figure out what we need to do better and get an actual representation of where our skills are at. However, sometimes this can be pretty dangerous, right? Like, especially for a high speed, dangerous sport like motorcycle racing. For an example, a motorcycle racer can be winning, can be feeling flow, doing great. It just takes one little rock to throw the balance and flow off, and this can lead to really dangerous things like really high speed crashes, right? All right, that is it. Intrinsic, extrinsic motivation and flow.